one question that we should ask ourselves perhaps is, do we have someone to keep a check on us?
Do we have a Kalyan Mitra?
Correct. The names of these 8 kings are recorded in the Agam Sthanang Sutra.
One of the greatest epics, that is Ramayana, also has its history linked back to the Ikshvaku dynasty.
Neminath Bhagwan, even Shri Krishna, they were all born in the Harivansh.
So you're telling me that the Shasan of the next Tirthankar hadn't started, but the Shasan of the previous Tirthankar had already ended.
There is one way to ultimately secure permanent happiness, and that is by practicing the dharma which has been shown by the Tirthankars, which of course is testimony to the fact that temples existed even back then. But surely there are descendants of Bhagwan's blood even today. Right?
So how did these Kshatriyas, Brahmins, Vaishyas, Shudras came into existence?
A Sansari can never be a guru. Only a Mahavradhari sadhu is fit to be a guru. Imagine, this person is now Bhagwan. And yet Indra Maharaja is requesting him to take on the clothes of a sadhu.
When we hear about Brahmins today, all we think about is priests and scholars. So how did they come into existence? In this episode of Rishabhayan, we travel back to the very beginning to discover how dynasties built civilizations and dharma give it a soul. Pranam, I'm Diya Nahar, and joining us today is Parshva Shah, an international disputes lawyer who represents his clients across courts in Dubai, England, Wales, as well as international arbitrations. Outside the courtroom, Parshva can usually be found with Sadhu Bhagwans and his books diving deep into the philosophy and history of Jainism. Parshva, let's begin on a different note today. Would you like to tell everyone about a fun fact about Adinath Bhagwan that not many people have heard of?
Thank you, Diya, for having me here firstly. What immediately comes to my mind first is this birth of Rishabdev Bhagwan as King Mahabal, which was his 4th birth. So because of his previous good karma, he was born as a king with, blessed with so many beautiful things on earth. He was very wise, very virtuous, a very just leader. But as time passed and, his kingdom, he consolidated his kingdom, he became increasingly attached in the riches of this world, with his various queens. And he started spending more time than ever, enjoying with them. One of his ministers, whose name was Swayam Buddha. Now, this minister, this mantri, was very concerned about his master's welfare. One of the words that is used for a minister in Sanskrit is amatya, someone who really looks after you, someone who's concerned about you. He had multiple ministers. This was the prime one. He thought to himself, what's the use of me being an advisor or minister to the king if I am unable to tell my master what he really needs to hear, which is, you need to work on yourself, become more detached, and turn inward, because there is a whole world inside of you that you are turning your back to. And one day he musters the courage and very humbly, with his hands folded, he tells the king, do you realize that all of these riches that you have and your wives, your family, all of these things are going to perish one day. So you have a limited time on earth. Why don't you make the most of it? And as soon as he says this in the middle of the court, as soon as he says this, there are other ministers who, of course, don't share the same belief. And it's so interesting to know, Rishabdev Bhagwan was born countless and countless years before us. And
Right.
This is a story that predates even that. And yet, the belief systems that people had back then too were so similar to what we see around us today. One of the ministers is a complete atheist. He thinks that there is no concept of a soul independent of a body. So he makes his arguments and says he says, why are you wasting your time trying to convince the king about, practicing dharma? Because there is really nothing of that sort. once the king is dead, he's dead. There's no soul that is going to travel to a different body, and life just ends. So as long he's here on earth, let him enjoy, let him make the most of his time, and let him do things as he wants. And then there are other ministers who have different beliefs which resemble other belief systems we see today. Swayambudh very logically, refutes each of these arguments.
Swayambudh is the name of the minister.
Yes. So he refutes each of these arguments, and he convinces the king that there is one way to ultimately secure permanent happiness, and that is by practicing the dharma which has been shown by the Tirthankars. It's useful to know here that we view Jainism as a philosophy that has been eternal. So as long as there is something known as the soul, and there is something known as liberation, call it moksha or nirvana, there is going to be a path to that, and that path is Jainism. So the king is convinced now, and he's so delighted that someone mustered the courage to say this to him, even though these words were harsh. Because the ministers earlier made fun of the minister Swayambudh. They said, where have you come from? How can you speak so rudely to your to the king and to your master? You work for him. Do you not remember that? Swayambudh, he's deaf to all of these allegations, and the king ultimately so delighted, he tells Swayambudh, you are my true friend because you are the one who sort of guided me on the right path. Having heard this, Muni Bhagwant comes to the king's capital city, and of course, now having attained this renewed faith in basic tenets of Indic philosophy such as the soul, vairagya, which is detachment, renunciation. With all of these newfound feelings, he goes and he bows down to the Muni Bhagwant, who then tells him that he only has a month's lifespan remaining.
Okay.
And the king is not bothered now. He would have been had he not attained dharma. But thanks to his friend, he attained, he retained a renewed faith. He decides to divide his time. He spends the first 8 days organizing a grand Ashtandika Mahotsav, which literally translates to an 8-day long celebration, where he ensures that pujas are performed everywhere in his kingdom, in all the janalayas back then, which of course is testimony to the fact that temples existed even back then. And at the end of these 8 days, he takes Diksha, he becomes a sadhu. And he does such amazing sadhana that within 22 days of practicing Diksha and giving up food and water, he's born as a Devta in the second Devlok, which is known as the Ishan Devlok.
But he understands all of this dharma, but dharma is itself established by him in a later birth, right?
That's a really interesting question. Warrants, so much understanding. Look, we view dharma as an eternal path, like I mentioned, and the path exists in all times. But it is Tirthankars who appear on the face of earth from time to time, give it a more organized form, so that even when the Tirthankars aren't present, the path is still easily discoverable by people, because there is an organization which helps them in discovering that path. So back then, there must have been some Tirthankar who had established a shasan, and it's because of this Tirthankar's organization that the minister and the king and eventually everyone in that period would have learnt about dharma.
Got it.
But more of that when we go
Dive
to our
deeper into it. Yes.
Lalitang, who is now the god in the second Devlok, the Atma of Rishabhdev Bhagwan, is accompanied by a Devi whose name is Swayamprabha. And they have a very tight, very intimate bond. Even as a Dev, he carries forward his previous sanskars of practicing dharma. So he performs pujas in eternal temples in an island called Nandishwar Dweep. he goes there to worship the Tirthankars and their Pratimas. And he spends a lot of time reflecting on everything he learned in the past. But he's also madly in love with Swayamprabha. And it so happens that Swayamprabha's lifespan is shorter than his. And she passes away from the Devlok quicker and is born on earth. And Lalitang cannot handle this. He moans, he sobs, he's wailing, and the echoes of his cries pervade the entire Viman. Thankfully, the minister Swayambud, at a later stage in his life, also took Diksha, and he's born as a god in the same Devlok.
Okay. Wow.
So when he hears these sobs, his heart feels a profound sense of connection and attachment. And that's because of the friendship that they nurtured in the previous birth. Swayambud has also carried forward his beliefs, his spiritual beliefs, and he shares them with the king. And he sort of solaces him by explaining, look, this was going to happen one day, and you're also going to walk away from this beautiful place. So why weep and why sob? And Lalitang is actually so moved that by this conversation, the minister as a god is now named Drad Dharma, and from one dev to another, the talk goes so well that Lalitang eventually forgets all his pain and anguish, and he's restabilized in his faith, and he passes away the rest of his Ayushya so well that it ensures that his future births don't take place in a bad setting, and that eventually paved the way for this Atma to become the Tirthankar that he was going to become. So I think this story or this particular birth of Shri Rishabh Dev is very unknown. But what's very important for us to take away is that even the Atma of a Tirthankar was at one point assisted by a Kalyan Mitra, a friend who is a well-wisher, who knows you in and out, and who can always give you spiritual counsel. And so, or when we hear of this story, one question that we should ask ourselves perhaps is, do we have someone to keep a check on us?
Do we have a Kalyan Mitra?
Correct. When we go work out at the gym, we have an accountability buddy, right? Who will keep on checking in and ask us, hey, have you worked out today? Have you done this today? Have you eaten according to your plan? And we take so many precautions thanks to this accountability buddy. Maybe it's time that we also develop a bond on a spiritual plane with someone and have a Kalyan Mitra in our life.
I think everyone can take away one thing from this podcast is that you can share things like this with your Kalyan Mitra.
Yes, of course.
So we've discussed in our previous podcasts that Raja Rishabdev was the first monarch. But what was his dynasty called? What was his lineage like?
Raja Rishabdev was indeed the first monarch, and his lineage was established very early on, when he hadn't even completed 1 year of his from his birth. So he was less than 1 year old, and you'd be interested to know that so the time cycle is a circular one, and it's divided into two halves. One is known as the Utsarpini and the other is known as the Avsarpini Kal. So we're going to talk of the Avsarpini half cycle. So in every half cycle, the Indra of the first Devlok, who we'll refer to as Indra generally, his name is Saudharmendra, it is the eternal conduct of Indra Maharaja to come down on earth after the birth of the first Tirthankar, who was also the first monarch in every Avsarpini, and establish in formal terms the first dynasty as well as the first Gotra. So dynasty is of course the clan in general terms, whereas Gotra refers to a lineage which is patriarchal. So you trace it back to your father, your grandfather and so on. Raja Rishabh was less than 1 year old, and Indra Maharaja applies his mind and he realizes that now is the time to establish the masters Vansh and Gotra. So very excitedly, he comes down to earth, and when he's about to go pay his respects and make this establishment, it occurs to him, I can't go empty handed before my master. What should I take for him? At that point, he notices a vast field of sugarcanes, and sugarcanes are considered to be auspicious. So he grabs a few stalks of sugarcane and he offers them to Sri Rishabdev, and he asks him, Prabhu, will you eat these? And Sri Rishabdev, who with his birth was endowed with the three types of knowledge, which also includes extrasensory knowledge, realized that the time has now come for my dynasty to be established, and he agrees to Indra's request, and so he extends his arm and he accepts the sugarcane stalk. Now, this is a very trivial thing when you think about two individuals, but the offerer is the lord of the first Devlok himself, Indra Maharaja, and the person accepting is the first Tirthankar and the first monarch. So, because he accepted the sugarcane, which is known as Ikshu in Sanskrit, and he consumed it, and thus the word Aku, the words compounded together.
Ikshu and Aku.
Yeah, so the words compounded together using the Sanskrit rules
Sandhi.
of grammar, the Sandhi, yes, that would result in Ikshvaku. And that is how the Ikshvaku Vansh or the Ikshvaku dynasty came about to be. With that, we learn from commentaries on the Agams that Bhagwan's ancestors also fed on sugarcane. And because of that, they were named, Bhagwan's Gotra was named as Kashyap Gotra.
So we often hear about the Suryavanshis and Chandravanshis, and I think when we talk about Suryavanshis, we hear about epics like Ramayana. So did these lineages also trace back to the Ikshvaku dynasty?
Yes, so this is very beautifully and very succinctly answered by the poet monk Shri Deep Vijayji Maharaja, who is famously credited with authoring the Halardu, a lullaby which Queen Trishla sings to baby Lord Mahavir.
And that we also speak.
We recited in Paryushan,
yeah.
yes. So Deep Vijayji Maharaja says in his Ashtapaji Puja, which honestly is such a good introduction to the life of Rishabdev Bhagwan, because the first half of this puja focuses exclusively on Bhagwan's life right from his origins. He says, Ikshvakumathi Surya Vanshare, Bharateshwaran Rupadipere, Ikshvakumathi Chandra Vanshite, Bahubali Jagajipere. We've heard in the previous episodes how Rishabdev Bhagwan had 100 sons, the eldest being Shri Bharat Maharaja, who was the first
Bharat
Chakravarti.
Chakravarti.
Yes. And the second, Shri Bahubaliji. They all had, both of them and Bhagwan's other sons also begat in turn their own offspring. Rishabdev Bhagwan's Bharat Chakravarti's eldest son was known as Surya Yasha, and Bahubaliji's eldest son was known as Chandra Yasha, or alternatively Somya Yasha. So from Surya Yasha came the Surya Vansh, and from Chandra Yasha came the Chandra Vansh, or also known as the Som Vansh. So many kings even today associate themselves with the Ikshvaku dynasty, and particularly with one of the two houses, the Surya Vanshi house or the Chandra Vanshi house. For example, if you were to go to Mewad and you go to the Royal Palace of Udaipur, there's an interesting chart about how they trace their lineage back to Sri Ram. But it's interesting how so many kings even today claim their descent from the Ikshvaku Vansh. And I think there is some truth in that, because even Shri Deep Vijayji Maharaja in the same puja, while talking about the Ikshvaku dynasty, says, Pratyaksha Varate Ajare. This Ikshvaku dynasty is seen even today. So I'm not sure who he was referring to, but surely there are descendants of Bhagwan's blood even today. You mentioned the Ramayana and the Mahabharata. you'd be pleased to know that Sri Ram and his ancestors, they're all also from the Ikshvaku Vansh, particularly from the Surya Vansh. In fact, grunts like Paumacharyam, which is the oldest version of the Jain Ramayana, and Trishashi Shalaka Purush Charitra, which also explains the Jain Ramayana in sufficient detail, talks extensively about Sri Ram's ancestors in the Ikshvaku dynasty. And most of them, when they come closer to the end of their lives, they renounce their kingdom, they renounce their families, and they set out on the path of a monk, and they either go to moksha or they go to Devlok. So it's quite fascinating, the track record that monarchs in the Ikshvaku dynasty have set.
So, Parshva, you spoke about how Ram's ancestors went to Moksha or Devlok. But what about Rishabdev Bhagwan's immediate successors? Rishabdev Bhagwan, of course, went to Moksha, and we've even covered in our previous episodes Marudeva Mata's story about how she went to
Interesting.
Moksha. So, what was the story and what was the history of the immediate successors of Rishabdev Bhagwan?
I think you've opened a portal of some really interesting things. So, Rishabdev Bhagwan's eldest son and successor was, of course, Bharat Chakravarti, who is the lord of 6 khands or land masses, equivalent of perhaps continents. At one point in his life, he was once sitting in a chamber known as Arisa Bhavan, which was a chamber full of mirrors. It's where he would deck himself with jewelry, his clothes, etc. And he was just seated there once, and he saw that a ring fell off his finger, and it occurred to him then that his finger looked so pale, and he was disgusted, if anything. So one by one, he started taking all jewelry off, and he realized that his hands really don't look that great the way he thinks they look when they're all adorned. This led him to reflect on the nature of the Atma and that which is separate from it. The latter is, of course, impermanent, and it is this reflection on impermanence of things, which we know as Anitya Bhavna, that led him to destroy all his karmas which obscured his ignorance, and he immediately destroyed his attachment, his aversion, his ignorance, and became Keval Jnani. He became all-knowing and all-seeing. He became Bhagwan.
Okay, so he became Bhagwan while being a Sansari.
He then spent considerable time as a sadhu, a Keval Jnani sadhu, of course. And at the end of his life, he attained nirvana. He went to moksha. What's even more interesting is that 8 successors after Bharat Chakravarti, when they were installed on the throne of the Ikshvaku dynasty in their respective time periods, also once encountered a similar experience where the ring slipped off their fingers, and each of them entered into the same reflective zone, and each of them destroyed their more pressing karmas at that point and attained Kevalyan in the exact same manner.
Okay.
So, of course, we've got Rishabdev Bhavan who went to moksha, we've got Bharat Chakravarti who went to moksha, and we have 8 kings after him, right after him, who also went to moksha. The names of these 8 kings are recorded in the Agam Sthanang Sutra in the 8th sthan. Now, the time period between Rishabdev and Ajitnath Bhagwan was abysmally large, and no 2 Tirthankars apart from these 2 have witnessed such a huge gap between them.
What was the gap between the two?
So, in scriptural terms, this time period is quantified as 50 lakh Kota Koti Sagropam. The words Kota Koti and Sagropam, of course, have their own meaning. But for present purposes, let's say it's countless
Really,
years.
really long
Yeah,
time.
a really long time. That meant countless kings even who sat on the throne of the Ikshvaku dynasty. Now, what's really interesting is that after these 8 kings went to moksha, every king up until Ajitnath Bhagwan's father, who also went to Moksha. Every king who came on that throne either went to Moksha in that same birth, or they went to the highest Devlok, which is known as the Anuttar Devlok, from where they will be reborn and attain Moksha immediately after. So I guess you have to be really lucky and really fortunate and have done really good karma to find a spot in this dynasty. What's one step more interesting is that we have a scripture known as Siddha Dandika, which is dedicated solely to counting how many of these kings went to Moksha and how many of these went to Devlok. And you'll be surprised to know that this phenomena of them going to one of the two places occurred in very calculated mathematical sequences, 7 sequences particularly. For example, the first sequence is known as the Anulom Siddha Dandika, wherein for every 14 lakh kings in the Ikshvaka dynasty that went to Moksha, the king that would succeed them, one king would go to the Anuttar Devlok, and then there would be 14 lakh kings who went to Moksha, and again another who went to the Anuttar Devlok, and so on for countless iterations. Then the iteration would change. 14 lakh kings would still go to Moksha, and then it would be 2 kings who went to the Anuttar Devlok, and this iteration would take countless, it would go on for countless cycles. So it builds up all the way till one iteration where there are 14 lakh kings who went to Moksha, and there are 50 kings who go to the Anuttar Devlok. And that completes the first sequence. The second sequence mirrors the first sequence. So for every 14 lakh kings that went to the Anuttar Devlok, there would be one who went to Moksha, and so on all the way up till 50.
You're telling me that all of these had patterns, but अगर कोई मोक्ष में जा रहा है या अनुत्तर देवलोक में जाके फिर मोक्ष में जाने वाले हैं, all of this is dependent upon an individual's karma, punya, pap, all of that. How do these patterns come into existence then?
Bilkul, I mean, that's a very valid point. I think the answer to this lies in the Jain philosophy of causation. There are 5 karans or 5 causes that cause anything or any event to happen. It could be us speaking here right now. It could be someone going to Moksha. It could be any crop, yielding fruit. All of this is governed by 5 causes. The causes are Niyati, which is destiny, Purusharth, which is one's own effort, Swabhav, which is the nature of that thing or person in context, Kal, which is time, and previous karma. So karma. So these 5 factors come together and run any event. And these 5 factors could vary in proportions. And so you're absolutely right in saying that these kings went to Moksha because of their own effort, and they got resources which helped them attain Moksha because of their punya in the past. But there's also the factor of destiny and time. It just so happened that they were destined to follow this particular pattern. And destiny is that one factor that determines the sequence of things. If you'd like to know more about the theory of causation in Jainism, I would urge you to read this very simple Gujarati stavan known as the Pach Karanonu Stavan by the prolific scholar monk Upadhyay Vinay Vijayji Maharaja. It's a very interesting setting. There are 5 advocates of each of the 5 causes. So for example, there is one who believes in only hustling, trusting the process, putting in the effort, doing Purusharth. He says that that's all that matters. You don't need to, look at any other factor. There is someone who says that everything depends on karma. So if I've done good karma, I'm going to get my fruit, and he's happy to sort of wait it out. One person says that time is of essence. So if something is going to happen at a definite time, it's only going to happen when it's time for it to happen. And no matter what you or I do, nothing can vary it. So when the time is right, things will happen. And you would have heard this from your friends too, and or perhaps somewhere even on Instagram, as
अभी मेरा समय सही नहीं चल रहा.
Absolutely, yeah. So you hear, even today, you hear advocates of each of these 5 causes. When you look at each of these arguments, you'll think, man, all of them sound correct. They all make sense to me. But equally problematic is the fact that when you only cling on to one factor and take the other factors out of the equation, you end up with something that doesn't sound very convincing. So they all bicker amongst themselves and they can't seem to reach consensus. So they go to the Samavasaran of a Tirthankar Bhagwan, and Bhagwan listens to all of them and then he says, look, each of these 5 factors does not operate alone. They all operate in tandem. So it's only when they come together will you actually witness an event. And he gives a very beautiful example of how a person uses a cloth or wears a cloth. Imagine a field of cotton. Now there are some plants which are rotten and you can't make any cloth out of that. So that's the nature. You need to have the nature to produce good quality cotton. There's a factor of destiny where even though there are say 100 plants which will yield good crop, say maybe only 70 of them are picked. You pick them and then it is the weaver's job to ready the cloth from that cotton.
Purusharth.
Yeah, which is their Purusharth. They can only be picked when their time is ripe. So that's how time factors in. And most importantly, or rather importantly, because we're giving equal weightage to each of the factors, it's only when the consumer has no antray karma or any karma stopping him from wearing that cloth when they can actually sort of make use of it. Because it could be that I want a particular commodity, but my karma is so bad that every time I go, they're out of stock. So this is how, it's a simple example, but that's how all 5 factors tie in. And it's the same for a person going to moksha as well.
So you've spoken about the 5 factors who are basically the cause of every single thing. But how do we use that in our practical life?
That's a great question. So I think it's linked with your question about them going to moksha. If one has to go to moksha, then one also needs to know what are the causes that will lead to me going to moksha. For example, when we're in very primitive life forms with only one sense, which in the scriptures is known as Nigodh, it is predominantly the factor of destiny that pulls us out from there, as opposed to karma. One has to put in the conscious effort or purusharth on destroying one's karma. Additionally, one's previous karma, good karma will give you the resources which you can utilize to advance advance, and bad karma will give you hindrances which will weigh you down. So it's only when you learn about these 5 factors that you're able to sort of understand what's stopping me, or what can I use as a catalyst. I say catalyst because all 5 factors operate with each other. We looked at the example of a mango, which ripens when it's time for it to ripen, when there's adequate heat. Alternatively, you could simply pluck the mango, put it in a box of hay and warm it up, and it ripens earlier than you would have thought. Similarly, our destiny to go to moksha might be at a certain stage, but by engaging in certain processes, you can speed up the entire process.
Okay.
So these processes are very simple and one can perform them anytime, anywhere. The first is seeking refuge in the Arihant and Siddha Bhagwans, in the Sadhu Bhagwans, and in the Dharma shown by the omniscient Paramatma. The second is bringing to mind and consciously professing guilt and repentance and seeking forgiveness for all bad deeds done by us. And the third is constantly, reflecting on the good deeds that we have done, not only the ones that we have done, but everyone in the world has done. And basically, and what this does is, it nullifies or severely reduces the impact of our bad karma and multiplies by leaps and bounds the good karma that we have done. So this is a simple process by which you can speed up your journey to moksha.
Wow. Okay, so I hope that all of us listening today take something from this, and hopefully we do inculcate this in our daily practices. So we spoke about the entire journey from Rishabdev Bhagwan to Ajitnath Bhagwan. But what about the rest of the Tirthankars? Were all of them from the Ikshvaku dynasty as well?
the Ikshvaku dynasty witnessed 22 Tirthankars, but not all of them.
Okay.
So, all Tirthankar Bhagwans, with the exception of Shri Muniswarat Swami Bhagwan, and who is the 20th Tirthankar, and the 22nd Tirthankar, Shri Neminath Bhagwan, were born in the Ikshvaku dynasty. These two Tirthankars were born in a different dynasty known as Harivansh.
Okay.
There's also a story about how the Harivansh came about to be. There was a common man who had a very beautiful and charming wife. The king of a particular kingdom fell in love with her, and he abducted her away and remarried or married her. Her name was Vanmala, and this commoner, he was walking by the palace one day, and he saw the king and his previous wife together at the balcony, and he felt really morose. He felt really angry even because the king forcibly abducted the wife. They were gazing at their city from the balcony when suddenly there was a bolt of lightning which struck on them, and they died immediately. And this man was delighted because it put an end to his misery and his suffering, seeing his wife with someone else. Eventually, he became a hermit, a tapas, and he did a lot of sadhana, by which he became a Kilbishik Dev, which is a god who's born in a very low rank. Using his limited knowledge, which was extrasensory nonetheless, both the king and queen were now reborn as twins or yugliks. A universal rule or a general rule, yugliks are born with very mild emotions, so they don't have excessive anger, excessive greed, excessive pride, etc. And their lives are also relatively simple with very little pop, as a result of which they usually go to Devlok after they die. This Devta, the commoner, is now worried that because they're born as Yugliks, they're going to complete their lifespan and go to Devlok, and he won't be able to inflict any harm on them. Revenge can be so poisonous at times that this person's thirst for vengeance has transcended so many births. The king and queen were born as Yugliks in a different region known as Harivarsh. In our region, that is the Bharat Kshetra, in the city of Champapuri, one king in the Ikshvaku dynasty had no child. So he was left without a successor, and the people in his kingdom were worried about how they could possibly find their next king. Devta used his knowledge and figured out that this is their plight, and using his celestial powers, he brought the Yugliks, the twins, from the Harivar Kshetra, and their sizes were huge. So he uses powers to reduce them in size and make them compatible with our sizes. And he told the people, as if prophesizing from the skies, these are your new king and queen. Install them on the throne, teach them how to hunt, and feed them fruits mixed with meat.
Okay, meat.
Yes. And the idea was to get them addicted to the taste of meat, to get them addicted to vices like hunting, which eventually led them to being sinful. And for the first time in infinite time cycles, a pair of Yuglik twins died and went to Narak. So this king, who the Devta said would be called Hari, and the queen, who would be called Harini, led to the development of the Harivansh, and his lineage was known as the Harivansh. And that's how we ended with another dynasty. So Shri Muniswarat Swami Bhagwan, Neminath Bhagwan, even Shri Krishna, they were all born in the Harivansh.
Okay, that's insightful. So the Ikshvaku dynasty has a lot of kings and monarchs and rulers. And in India in general, when we speak about kings, the first thing that comes in our mind are Kshatriyas. But we've also heard about the four Varnas.
Right.
So how did these Kshatriyas, Brahmins, Vaishyas, Shudras came into existence?
Before Rishabdev Bhagwan, there was only one human race, and this is mentioned in the commentaries on the Agams. Particularly, there's quite a bit on this in the Niryukti on the first Agam, Shri Acharang Sutra, as well as the Agam, Shri Avashak Sutra. When Rishabdev Bhagwan established social functions and departments, Bhagwan gathered horses, elephants, etc. for for the welfare of the state. And after that, he organized certain groups. There was a group that functioned as soldiers, as guards, as infantry, the Arakshaks, which were collectively known as the Ugrakul. Then we had the Bhogkul, which was families or groups of elders, teachers, advisors, mentors, etc. We then had Rajanyakuls, which would be groups of friends, relatives, companions. So these together, along with the others, were collectively known as Kshatriyas, and they were the more privileged section of the society. At the time, those who weren't Kshatriyas came to be known as Shudras, and they were consigned to other functions. When Sri Rishabdev taught the various arts, craft, trades, etc. to the people, those who engaged in these activities of commerce came to be known as Vaishyas.
So the earliest forms of entrepreneurs and professionals, they were the Vaishyas.
Yes.
And when we hear about Brahmins today, all we think about is priests and scholars. So how did they come into existence?
The Jain position in that is the inverse of what other beliefs are, where they say that Brahmins originated from the mouth of a particular deity. Our belief is that they were the last order to emerge, and there is a very interesting story behind their emergence. After Sri Rishabdev Bhagwan attained Keval Jnana and formally established the Dharma Tirth, Bhagwan spoke about the importance of offering food, water, clothes, etc. to those who had renounced the world and walked on the path of monkhood. Bhagwan's eldest son Bharat Chakravarti was very moved, and he wanted to offer food to Mahatmas as well. He expressed his interest in doing that, and Bhagwan forbade him because the food from royal households is not acceptable for monks. And he was really sad.
Why is it not acceptable?
So, food from royal households, which includes the palaces of kings, their ministers, and those who function in the upper level of royalty, are forbidden because you have to go through unnecessary screening every time you go there to collect food, which would mean longer time to collect bhiksha. And the Tirthankas are so particular that Mahatmas do not waste their time unnecessarily. A, it's going to lead to wastage of time, which they could have otherwise used for Swadhyay. B, the food is excessively tasty and it engages the sense of taste, which is not ideal for a Mahatma, who are otherwise supposed to abstain from eating any dairy, ghee, oil, sugar, etc. So, for multiple reasons. It is Indra Maharaja who immediately spotted that his Sadharmic brother is feeling very gutted that he can't offer food and do Supatra Dan. And so Indra Maharaja explained that there are various types of Supatra, the higher ones of course being Sadhu Bhagwans, but even fellow Jain laymen and women are who are known as Sadharmics or co-religionists. They are also Supatra because they share a profound faith in the universal truths as well as practice a lot of vows. So he invites them all to his palace. He tells them, please do not engage in farming and in other activities, and use that time instead to do Swadhyay, to study the scriptures and reflect on the words of my father and the father of the world, that is Rishabdev Bhagwan, which is such a good indication that though Bhagwan did teach these activities, for sustenance of the society at that point in time, these activities are ultimately sinful. And as Jains, we should bear in mind that they are also worth renouncing. Bhagwan only taught them because there was a necessity, and to curb other evils that would have taken place had Bhagwan not discharged this duty. But Bhagwan ultimately renounced it, and his successor Bharat Chakravarti, even though he was the emperor of such a large empire, he was asking his own people to abstain from these activities. And he asks them to give him the opportunity to serve them food and, partake in this bhakti. And so he'd also taught them to remind him every day. And there's a famous verse recorded in Trishashi Shalaka Purush Charitra where these fellow Jain Shravaks and Shravakas remind Bharat Chakravarti, "O king, you are being overpowered. The fear increases day by day. Therefore, do not commit violence, do not commit violence. Mahana, mahana." Or in Prakrit, mahana, mahana. He meant to say that because of the weight of this emperor, he's being overpowered by attachment and aversion. And the fear of death hanging over him increases day by day. And therefore, it is ideal that he stays grounded and eventually abstains from all sorts of violence altogether. Imagine a kingdom where even the local population was free to say this to the king. Not only that, the king himself wanted to hear this. If we go back to our story in the beginning, the king did treat them all as his Kalyan Mitras. And so, because this was the Chakravarti's palace, everyone wanted to partake in that delightful, tasty food. And so, a lot of people who would not have met the threshold qualification for entering also barged inside the palace, and it became chaotic. A lot of people came in more than expected, and there weren't enough facilities for those sadharmics for whom the food was actually meant. So Bharat Chakravarti instructed his people, his staff, to screen everyone who came in, quiz them on the fundamentals of Jainism, which we know as the 9 tattvas, and see how many vows they were actually practicing. And once they were screened and they were qualified, they would be given a golden thread which they would wear and which would symbolize that I have passed the screening test and I am now a Vratdhari Shravak who's been certified by Bharat Chakravarti's palace. And so this order of Vratdhari Shravaks, because they practiced Brahmacharya, came to be known as Brahmins. And because they repeated the phrase Mahana Mahan every day, they also came to be known as Mahans, which is the other name for Brahmins.
Okay.
The thread that they wore was made of gold, as we saw. But in later Tirthankar's time, the material of the thread changed to silver and then to some other materials, and then eventually the cotton threads that we see Brahmins wearing today.
That exists even today.
Indeed. The idea of Brahmins as Bharat Chakravarti intended and what we see today is quite distinct. As a way to pay homage to Rishabdev Bhagwan and to instruct or to remind sadharmics about their duties as Jain Shravaks and Shravakas, Bharat Chakravarti himself authored 4 granths which were known as the 4 Vedas at the time. Rishabdev Bhagwan's religious organization or Shasan continued till the point Ajitnath Bhagwan established his own, which in turn continued till the 3rd Tirthankar Sambhavnath Bhagwan established his own, and so on till Suvidhinath Bhagwan's time, the 9th Tirthankar Bhagwan. After Suvidhinath Bhagwan's Nirvan, some years passed and the Shasan also came to an end. And by that we mean that the scriptures which direct people on the right path, as well as sadhus who give sermons on the right path, both became extinct. But there was still a lay Jain population who wanted to learn more about Dharma.
So you're telling me that the Shasan of the next Tirthankar hadn't started, but the Shasan of the previous Tirthankar had already ended.
That's right. So, Suvidhinath Bhagwan's Shasan ended before Sheetalnath Bhagwan's Shasan was established. Sheetalnath Bhagwan's Shasan ended uh, before Shreyansnath Bhagwan's Shasan was established. And this went on till Shantinath Bhagwan. And then again, we see, we're restored to normalcy where Shantinath Bhagwan's Shasan ends or rather is subsumed once Kuntunath Bhagwan, the next Tirthankar, establishes his Shasan. But in these interim periods, Suvidhinath Bhagwan onwards, and this is, by the way, the time period when the Harivansh was also established, Suvidhinath Bhagwan's reign. In this time period, there were lay Jain practitioners present even after Suvidhinath Bhagwan's Shasan had come to an end. And they were curious about Dharma, but there was no one to guide them, except for other lay Jains who belonged to this order of Brahmins that we saw earlier. And they began preaching Dharma, but because they were householders, greed kicked in at some point. The other lay Jains who were instructed in Dharma by these Brahmins felt really grateful, and so they made very generous gifts to the Brahmins, which in turn, uh, increased their greed because they are householders ultimately. And eventually, these Jain Brahmins began corrupting the original Vedas made by Bharat Chakravarti and started placing unnecessary emphasis on the role of Brahmins in society. So they would talk about how one must make donations of gold, silver, land, cattle, etc. to Brahmins, and all the other practices that we hear of where Brahmins are at the focus. This snowballed and led to a scenario where the entire society was dominated by Brahmins, who then began being worshipped as gurus. In fact, this was so rare to happen in a Jain setting in the infinite cycles of time that have passed before and infinite cycles of time in the future. This half of the time cycle is so unique because it is the only one where householders were worshipped as gurus. Otherwise, for Jain practitioners to worship any sort of householder, no matter how enlightened they are, is absolutely forbidden, even if they were not greedy. The Yog Shastra by Acharya Bhagwan Hemchandra Sureshwarji Maharaja clearly defines a guru to mean Mahavrata Dharadhira Bhaiksha Matropajivana Samayikastha Dharmopa Deshaka Gurovo Mataha. Those who patiently endure the weight of the 5 Mahavrats, those who subsist on bhiksha, on gochri, those who are constantly in samayik, which is in a state of equanimity, as well as a state where they do not commit violence towards anyone, those who only preach dharma and nothing else, these are called gurus in the Jain Shasan. And yet, from the time of Suvidhinath Bhagwan onwards, we witnessed an abnormality.
So the Avsarpani Kal that you're talking about that we are in right now isn't just bad because we're in the say 5th era right now, but it's this particular Avsarpani Kal is worse than any other
Yes.
or countless other Avsarpani
Correct.
Kals.
That's absolutely correct. Which is why this particular Avsarpani Kal is known in the scriptures as Hunda Avsarpani Kal, which denotes a degree of more dangers, more terrifying business, really.
So you mentioned that whoever hasn't taken the 5 Mahavrats cannot be worshipped as a guru. But you also said earlier that Bharat Chakravarti got Keval Gnan before he took Diksha because he got it in the Arisa Bhavan. And that I'm assuming wasn't when he
Of course.
took Diksha. It was in his Sansari roop. So then how do we worship him as a Keval Gnani, as a guru while he was a Sansari?
you've already seen the level of detachment he had as a householder. And truly, even Hindi and Gujarati Stavans and Sajjais, uh, sing songs of his praises by saying "Man mein hi vairagi Bharatji, man mein hi vairagi."
But he was still a householder, right?
Yeah. But what one should really see here are two things. A, the ideal marg is to take Diksha ASAP when one can and when one has the ability, because that really is the Raj marg or the primary path to attain Kaivalyan and therefore Nirvan. To the extent that one cannot, one can practice dharma to the best extent possible in the sansar while yearning desperately to walk on that path. And Bharat Chakravarti, up until this point, was unable to follow path one, so he followed the second path. Now, while he was a householder, the state of his bhav, his thoughts were so pure that even a tiny event like the ring slipping off his finger led to such a drastic result, which is him attaining Kaivalyan. This is not a norm, this is an exception. And only few people are actually able to attain Kaivalyan in this state, which is the state of a householder, which is why the main marg still remains to be that of a monk. However, even if we were to concede that Bharat Chakravarti attained Kaivalyan as a householder, what's really interesting is that even Indra Maharaja is unwilling to treat this exception as a norm, which is seen when Indra Maharaja learns of Bharat Chakravarti's Kaivalyan. He immediately comes down onto the earth, but he waits before he bows down to him. He presents the garb of a sadhu. He says, please take on the sadhu vesh and wear it. And it's only after Bharat Chakravarti himself wears it, because now there's no reason for him not to, does Indra Maharaja do Vandan to him. Imagine, this person is now Bhagwan. And yet Indra Maharaja is requesting him to take on the clothes of a sadhu, and Bharat Chakravarti too does not protest at all. Both parties understand that if Indra Maharaja were to do Vandan to Bharat Chakravarti in this stage, people would think that
That we're doing Vandan to a Sansari.
correct, which would set a very wrong precedent. And we saw that abnormality happen later in Sivadinath Bhagwan's Shasan. But even more relevantly, it often feels that this abnormality has continued till date, where we see so many new paths emerging, and we hear of certain people who claim to have attained either omniscience or a high degree of knowledge and detachment. But no matter what or how advanced they are, a sansari can never be a guru. Only a Mahavradhari sadhu is fit to be a guru.
That is so surprising and so relevant to today's time as well, because we often see that, unfortunately, in our society even today.
Yeah, I think there are so many incidents scattered across the Ikshvaku dynasty and each character in the Ikshvaku dynasty that uh, there are takeaways that feel relevant even to today's day and age. At the time of Shri Rishabdev Bhagwan's Nirvan, a lot of devtas, of course, crores and crores of devtas had come down onto the earth, and they had all come together to celebrate and also mourn the passing away of Bhagwan. The funeral pyre was constructed, and among all devtas, the Agni Kumar Devta lit the pyre, because of which developed a famous proverb in Sanskrit, which translates to Agni is the foremost among devtas, because he got this first chance. Once the pyre was lit, a lot of people wanted to preserve the flames of Bhagwan's funeral pyre with themselves. So they took logs of that fire and they placed that fire in their own homes. They installed that fire in their own homes and they began to, pay respects to that fire. Those who did not have a chance to do that took the ashes away after Bhagwan's funeral, and they sort of started applying those ashes on their forehead. And because of the first practice, uh, the Brahmins later began to have rituals associated with fire, such as, offering grains, etc., to the fire, because they interpreted this maxim or this line that I mentioned earlier to mean that Agni is the highest among all devtas, so you should worship him.
But in fact, it wasn't just
Yeah, it was a
Agni.
misinterpretation.
Correct.
So things often start with a noble cause, but somewhere the purpose is lost, and rituals are built around a misinterpretation of the original idea. These ashes were used by people to apply a tilak on their forehead using the three fingers. So in this manner, which came to be known as the Triprundra tilak. And that's how these practices emerged. In this manner, so many Kshatriyas, Shudras, Vaishyas, and Brahmins practiced the dharma that Rishabdev Bhagwan later showed in his life. And in the Shasana of Rishabdev Bhagwan alone, thousands and thousands of people from all four Varnas attained their spiritual welfare, and they attained moksha.
So we don't believe in any kind of a discrimination that a particular Varna can't go to moksha. All four Varnas, people from all four Varnas can go to moksha.
Oh, yes, absolutely. There is another Jain sect which does believe that Shudras cannot be given Diksha or cannot go to moksha. But we definitely do not share that belief. In fact, one of our agams, the Uttaradhyayan Sutra, has an entire chapter dedicated to Sri Harikeshi Muni, who was born in what the society back then called a Shudra family, and he took Diksha and he attained moksha.
We spoke in our previous episodes, and even you mentioned how Rishabdev Bhagwan taught the world so many kalas, agriculture, etc. We also hear that he gave the world the first dharma. So, how did he teach the world the first dharma, and how did so many other dharmas, how did so many other religions emerge?
May I please clarify that Sri Rishabdev's life must be analyzed in two distinct settings. First, his life as king, where he had to do what was necessary to ensure that society did not fall prey to worse evils such as theft, inappropriate behavior with others, killing, which is why he taught these activities even though they were sinful. But this Rishabdev, on taking Diksha and attaining Keval Jnana, which is omniscience, did not once promote these activities because they were inherently sinful. And one who wants to embark on a spiritual journey finds no purpose in these activities, of course. So, what really is the summum bonum, or the ultimate goal, the ultimate aim of one's life? Sri Rishabdev Bhagwan was the first person to share with the world that this highest good is moksha or nirvana, which is the state of the soul where one is free from all karmas, one is absolutely happy, and this joy is one that is innate, it belongs to our own self. He spoke about how we have infinite vision, infinite knowledge, our perception is infinite, how there is no hindrance to the kind of happiness that we enjoy from being our original selves. This philosophy, or this concept that he shared, became the foundation of all Indic philosophies. So any dharma of this Aryavart will absolutely talk about one state known as nirvana or moksha. They may differ on what the soul is like, and they may differ on what exactly happens when a person goes to nirvana. We're all united when we talk about the concept, the very existence of a state called moksha. To attain this moksha, one has to serve the means. The means are known as dharma. And dharma, as I've seen earlier, is just the path. So right belief, right knowledge, and right conduct are the means or the dharma to attain moksha. It sounds like a one-liner answer, but there is so much profundity hiding in this. So to explain this in a more elaborate, a more practical manner, after attaining Keval Jnana, because of his previous karmas that made him a Tirthankar, Paramatma establishes the first Dharmatirth or the Shasan. A Shasan, the word Shasan is often used in the sense of governance. We use that word even for our local authorities. This Shasan also governs, it also disciplines people in it, just like there are laws in a country. But this Shasan is not limited to worldly affairs. It is meant for everything that is not part of worldly affairs. And so this Lokottar Shasan, a Shasan which transcends this world, was established by him in Purimtal, which is today known as Prayagraj, which is why it's such an important place even for us Jains. There is a beautiful description of the divine pavilion or the Samavasaran where the Tirthankar Bhagwan preaches. And Rishabdev Bhagwan was the first. So the description of that Samavasaran in the scriptures is even more elaborate. So Bhagwan delivered his first deshna or sermon on right belief and the various vows that follow right belief. And on hearing this very mighty deshna of the all-knowing Rishabdev Bhagwan, so many people were moved and they wanted to take Diksha. So many people wanted to take Diksha, but they did not have the strength. So they decided to, take lesser vows, which are those of laymen. There were 84 disciples, 84 individuals who became Bhagwan's first disciples, who are known as the Gandhars. On hearing this Deshna, they had a question in their mind. Bhaivam kim tattam? Bhagwant, what is the fundamental truth or what is the tattva in this world? What's the core of it all? So they ask Bhagwan, Bhaivam kim tattam? And Bhagwan answers in one phrase, Upanneva. It originates. And each Gandhar asks this question, okay? So 84 Gandhars asking this question over 3 rounds, as we'll see. They ask this question again, Bhaivam kim tattam? And Bhagwan says, Vigameva. It gets destroyed. And they reflect on this again.
It originates, it destroys.
Yeah. So
Okay.
they reflect on this again. And they think that, okay, this gives me a lot of clarity, but there's still something missing from the equation. So they ask the question once again. And Bhagwan answers, Dhuveva. It is Dhruv, or it is permanent. And these 3 phrases are collectively known as the Tripadi. Everything contained in this world originates, it gets destroyed, and it is present at the same time, which at first is so confusing because they're all opposite to each other.
Yeah, how can something stay but also get destroyed
Exactly.
but stay at the same time?
So these 3 phrases are very cryptic for us, but the Gandhars are blessed with a very subtle form of intellect known as Bij Buddhi. So just like a seed can give birth to a massive, banyan tree, this Tripadi acts as the seed out of which the Gandhars churn so much that they are able to grow an entire tree of the 12 core scriptures known as the Dwadashangi or the 12 Ang Agams.
Okay.
These 12 agams act as the constitution of what we are going to study as the Jain Shasan. Alternatively, they are the first form of the Jain organization. They are a manifestation of the Jain organization.
Okay. This is how the Agams came to be.
Yes, these are the first core agams came to be. There are of course other agams too. Everything in this world that can be expressed orally or in writing or can be expressed at all, the upper limits of these scriptures are hit in these agams. So beyond these agams, there is nothing that you can express in terms of true knowledge. And this is all in their brain. And they do this in a span lesser than 48 minutes. But remember that these Gandhars still do not have Keval Jnana, which means that they are still far from having complete knowledge, even though they have substantially much higher knowledge than anyone else present on earth at that point. So to ratify these 12 Ang Agams, you need approval from the Kevaljani Tirthankar.
Correct.
So, because in this Shasan, till the end of a particular Tirthankar Shasan, the Gandhar's Dwadashangi is going to be the governing law for that Shasan. So it has to be completely perfect. And since the Tirthankars are called Tirthankars because they established the Tirth, which is the Dharma Tirth, they are the ones who ratify these scriptures. At this point in time, Indra Maharaja stands with a plate made of diamonds, and this plate has a heap of fragrant sandalwood powder, which is known as Vas Churna. And Rishabdev Bhagwan grabs fistfuls of this fragrant powder, and he places a fistful each on the head of all 84 Gandhars, approving their Dwadashangi, and at the same time granting them all the rights and powers to manage the Shasan. Because the Tirthankar is above all emotions and passions, he naturally will not, engage in any activity relating to management. But the Gandhars still haven't reached that stage. And so they can surely engage in disciplining all 4 parts of the Shasan, which is the monks, the nuns, the laymen, and laywomen.
Sandalwood powder that he places, is that the same as Marasai putting Vaskep on us now?
So exactly. So it's good that you picked this up, because the origins of Mahatmas putting Vasak shape on our heads, in fact, lies in this. The Tirthankars put Vasak shape on the heads of Gandhars to grant them permission to ratify their scriptures. You would have seen that even in Ubdhan, when a person receives the right to attain certain sutras, as a mark of granting them that right, Acharyas or Mara Sahibs put Vasak shape on the heads of the Aradhaks.
Yeah, we were asked to go in rounds, and
Correct.
every time we got a sutras right, we were
Absolutely.
placed with.
I forgot to mention at the outset, when a Tirthankar enters the Samavasaran, he circumambulates the Ashok tree in the center, which is 12 times the size of a Tirthankar, and he bows down by saying Namo Tithasya. I bow down to the Tirth. So I bow down to the Shasan. A Tirthankar who has fulfilled all purposes in life,
And is essentially above everyone else.
yes, he still bows down to the Shasan. And this, perhaps, Diya, will answer a question that you asked me early on, which is in context of Mahabal Raja's Bhav, where he attained something from the Shasan. So, Shri Bhadrabhav Swami Maharaja identifies 3 causes behind the Tirthankars bowing down to the Shasan, and one of the reasons, in fact, is that the Tirthankars have also become a Tirthankar because of a certain Tirth or Shasan in the past. So they are sort of, letting the world know that it is this Shasan that brought me here, and this Shasan will also uplift you.
Yeah, so it's all interlinked together.
It's all interlinked. Of course, another reason is Vinay, or respect towards entities that are worthy of respect, is a very essential quality of Dharma. The scriptures say that, the Vinay is the mool or the root of Dharma. And by practicing Vinay himself, Bhagwan is teaching us by example that you should also practice Vinay, in your lives towards the Shasan and towards its various elements. So coming back, the Dwadashangi is the first manifestation of the Shasan. Then the Sangh that follows it is the second manifestation. Another manifestation is the Gandhars themselves, because they embody the Shasan.
Sorry, the Sangh is the Sadhu, Sadhvi, Shravak, Shravika.
Correct. The Chaturved, or the fourfold Sangh, is also a manifestation of the Tirth. The Gandhars are also a manifestation of the Tirth. The path to attain moksha, in terms of Samyak Darshan, Jnana, Charitra, is also a manifestation of the Tirth. And you can say that these are all various facets of the same diamond, which is the Shasan, or various parts of an entity known as the Shasan. So when we talk about the Shasan, it's all of these elements that come together and they're linked with each other. Now, when a Tirthankar preaches, because he's all-knowing, whenever he talks about any particular thing, he will talk about it from all perspectives. These perspectives often seem to be contradictory. For example, you could be a daughter, but you could also be a mother. You could be a sister, but you could also be an aunt. And while the words daughter and mother sound opposite to each other, you see both characteristics can reside in a person at the same time.
Yes.
How do you understand that both of them reside in a person at the same time? You understand it by clarifying that you are a daughter with respect to your mother, and you are a mother with respect to your daughter.
Correct.
So it is by clarifying the relativity relative to what or to who that you're able to make a statement. To discern the truth, one has to understand various perspectives which often seem contradictory to each other, but they're not. So, for example, is the Atma permanent or impermanent? Rishabdev Bhagwan said it is partly permanent and partly impermanent. Permanent because no matter where you go, you're always going to be separate from the body, and your eternal nature of being joyful, of being all-knowing, even though obscured, will still be as it is, in a way. But if something were completely permanent in absolute terms, then there can be no change in it at all. Because if something is changing in anything, it shows that to some degree there is some impermanence because something
Yeah.
has changed.
Correct.
So, in case of the Atma, when one ceases to be a human after their death and they become, say, an animal or a dev, their paryay or their stage as a human has been destroyed, and their stage as a devta has now been created. So this is how the Tripadi also functions. In terms of the original element, that is the Atma, that is permanent, which Bhagwan mentioned as part of the third phrase. And yet, one part of it got destroyed, one part of it was created. To give you a better example, say I'm wearing a golden bracelet and I melt it and I make a golden chain. The element of gold, the dravya of gold, remains as is. So that is permanent. But the paryay of the bracelet has been destroyed and I have created a paryay
necklace. So that is what is created.
Exactly. So when Bhagwan was delivering this Tripadi, he meant to explain to the Gandhar Bhagwans that whether you take a living or non-living thing in this world, everyone and everything that you see around you, you cannot see around you, has these characteristics of changing to a certain degree, that is witnessing some form of creation and destruction, but at the same time being inherently permanent, a feature very unique to Jainism. However, not everyone in the audience is able to understand and appreciate the concepts even if they are taught by Bhagwan. And Jainism is very clear that even Bhagwan Tirthankars themselves cannot change the minds of certain people who already have prejudices or who have very rigid thoughts in their mind.
I think you mentioned previously that everyone who followed the Tirthankar, the first Tirthankar, were in the Ikshvaku dynasty, and there were some people who did not still follow him, right?
So even after listening to this, they only took that perspective which suited them. And so this resulted in the development of gradually other faiths, some of which were modeled on the premise that the Atma is completely permanent, which means that it cannot change at all. And some other faiths which were modeled on the premise that the Atma is completely impermanent, so it keeps on flickering every second and changing. And so we've got two extremes, both of which have correct perspectives but not in the right place. Rishabdev Bhagwan did the noble job of putting these perspectives together, and you will find this similarity even in context of the five factors. There were people who had five different perspectives, but Rishabdev Bhagwan was the first person to put them all in one place and said, look, don't cling on to an idea of absolutism. Understand how relativity works and how perspectives are relative to each other. You can be a mother and a daughter, but it would be absurd to say that you're also the son or the father of someone. So you can only put in those perspectives which are timely and which fit in that context. And that is how other faiths slowly started developing in this Aryavart. But like I said, there is so much common ground nonetheless in terms of our shared concepts of Atma, Punya, Pap, Parlok, Moksha, etc.
Wow, so this was a very thoughtful explanation. Parshva, my very last question to you is, why do we need to go back and understand all of this history? Why is it relevant to our times today?
I think going back to our roots really helps us understand how the Ikshvaku Vansh shaped Dharma. It's important to remember that they've been a dynasty that's been around for the longest time, and their kings, most of them, were exemplary rulers, and they've preserved the values that Rishabdev Bhagwan taught, uh, which were appropriate even for householders, having an ethical rule, being just, being fair, listening to both parties. I think all of these values, even if they prevail to a lesser extent today, to the extent that they do prevail, it's all thanks to the Ikshvaku dynasty. We learn about so many characters and the mistakes that they made. That includes even Tirthankars like Mahavir Swami, who was born in the Ikshvaku dynasty. And very importantly, the Agams even say that even listening to the names of the Gotras and the Vansh of Tirthankars, leads to the accrual of great fruit. So we also need to remember that being proud of the heritage that our Tirthankars have given us is obviously great, but at the same time, we should not indulge in arrogance about our descent, our lineages, and because it is this arrogance that led to Mahavir Swami Bhagwan's Jeev binding karma, which he took with him till his last birth. So I think these are some very important lessons, and of course, by learning about how our Dharmatit came to be established, and how subsequent faiths emerged, we can think of the beautiful scriptural analogy of the ocean and the rivers, where you've obviously studied the water cycle when you were a kid in school, and the waters from the sea get evaporated, and it rains in different regions, and then there are rivers which carry the water back to the sea, and that's how the water cycle completes itself. Paramatma's Shasan is an ocean of knowledge, and this knowledge means knowledge of various true perspectives. We can use this analogy to understand how subsequent rivers or subsequent faiths took elements of Bhagwan Shasan with themselves, and they developed their own philosophies. As the very scholarly Bhagwan Siddhasen Divakar Sureshwarji Maharaja puts it, when you aggregate the truth in all other faiths, the resulting product that you get is the original faith, which is Jainism.
That's so true. This is such a unique way of describing our culture and our religion. Before we conclude, are there any sources that our audience can view if they want to learn more about all of these topics?
Sure. So the Ashtapaji Puja that I mentioned earlier is in Gujarati, and it's often been performed at multiple places across the country. So definitely do attend one, read the book, read the puja, and acquaint yourselves with an outline of Bhagwan's life. If you want to go a layer deeper, you can read the Rishashi Shalaka Purush Charitra, which has the biographies of all Tirthankars, Chakravartis, etc. But in great detail, a biography of Rishabdev Bhagwan, which is relevant to our topic. And there's also a trav of various stotras and stutis of Rishabdev Bhagwan, which highlight particular, you know, qualities of his life. So, Pandit Dhanpal Kavi, he's made 50 verses dedicated to Rishabdev Bhagwan, which are known as Rishabh Panchashaka. Those are verses in Prakrit and really worth memorizing. So I think all of these together, if one were to study, preferably in the Nishra or the tutelage of Guru Bhagwans, then I think there's a lot to learn about and from Rishabdev Bhagwan and everything that he left behind for us.
So thank you so much, Parshva, for taking out
Thanks
the
for having me
time.
here.
From ancient stories to modern implementations, there's so much to learn from our history and from our religion. And to our listeners, thank you so much for tuning in. I hope you liked this video and learned something from it. And please subscribe to our channel so that you do not miss out on any other interesting conversations that we have. Like and share this video, and I'll see you in the next episode.